Good evening, everyone. My name is Amy Sass, Artistic Director of Ragged Wing Ensemble and host of Moment to Moment. For those joining us for the first time, Moment to Moment is a live talk series exploring what can be learned, felt, and created during this time of transformation. This program is produced by Ragged Wing Ensemble, a small but mighty theater and arts organization. It was born out of a need to connect, to spark dialogue, and to do what humans have always done since ancient times, share stories. By sharing stories, we evolve humanity. To officially begin, I invite you to join me in a simple meditation. The purpose of this meditation is to slow us down, because a lot of times we use these devices to speed up, to multitask, to go quickly, and but we're going to use this room, this space together that is like slower and more intentional, so that we can have space for creativity, depth, and connection in the conversations that we're about to have. So I'm going to read a few words, and light a candle. And I invite you to just kind of give yourself whatever care you need at this time while I'm doing this, and just let yourself kind of tap into this moment. I consider this a bit of an invocation. I call it the arrival. We arrive here, now, in this moment. We arrive with awareness, knowing that we are attending from different physical locations and different time zones. We arrive knowing that no matter where we are, we all sit on Indigenous land. We arrive aware of the need for healing and systemic change. We arrive here, now, into a digital space that some folks have access to and some do not. We arrive with breath, with body, with intention. And I invite you to take this moment to just feel the surface that supports your body wherever you are. Maybe you're standing, maybe you're sitting, maybe you're lying down, whatever it is. And just let the breath come in and out. Allow calm to settle into your cells. And as you breathe, imagine you are creating space inside your belly, a vast space. Like maybe the ocean. And then you take that notion of a vast space and put it into your chest. Your throat. Your face. A lot of times we spend a lot of time focusing so much with our face. But just kind of letting that go. And as you engage in this program, feel free to give yourself whatever care you need, because it's an intense time right now, and care is a great place to start. Thanks for joining me in that. And I'm going to introduce the topic, and we're going to get started. Hooray! So tonight's topic is everything is connected. And we are going to explore the connections between the global pandemic, the fight for racial justice, and the changing chemistry of the earth, where we'll be looking at the many facets of this immense, historic, tumultuous time that we are living in right now. Our guest this evening is a person who has devoted his life's work to making soulful, deep connections across time, space, oceans, land masses, and cultures. His detailed work, The World Without Us, explores the impact of humans have on the planet, on each other, and on other precious life forms. It asks, what would happen to the world if humans blipped out of existence today? Please welcome international journalist and best-selling author, Alan Weisman. Hey, Alan.
Thanks, Amy. Nice to be here with you.
I'm so glad you can join us. Alan you're in Massachusetts, right?
I am, and you're in Oakland, and I was out there not long ago. I'm sorry our paths didn't cross.
Well, here we are today. And I mean, I feel really excited having you on this program. We only met like 10 weeks ago, and I've been reading your book. I finished your book very recently, and I just feel like I have the places that you take us in this book, in this, what I consider to be a kind of great aria to life on this planet is how I would describe it. The places you take us to are, some dark, disturbing details about how we live on the planet, and also some beautiful places that existed long ago, before Homo sapiens even existed in time, and then humor. I feel like I have been getting to know you through your book over the past 10 weeks. And it's been a pleasure to get to know you. So we've been in conversation, even though we haven't been in conversation. I would love to start tonight, if you could just, before we kind of get into the book and other topics that you've been exploring and all of that, I'm so curious just to begin with a little bit of context about how you found journalism, how that came, because we've been talking about journalism as pulling from all these different finding these connections, and how you came to this work.
Well, I kind of walked boldly into it backwards. I tried a few other things that didn't really work for me. At one point, I was out there in the Bay Area. I enrolled in law school at UC Berkeley, and lasted almost an entire semester. It was a real bridge burning thing, because I had no idea what I was going to do after that. But basically, when I was in college, I didn't have any clue. I was surrounded by all these people who knew they wanted to be doctors, or they wanted to be this or that or the other thing. And I was interested in all of it. And finally, I discovered that journalism is a way to basically keep going to school. A journalist is not an expert in anything, but has to become a very quick study, because journalists get the opportunity to poke their nose into what all these other people are doing, all these other experts who knew what their specialty was going to be. And I've had the most marvelous life, going with people from all walks of life. I mean, I've been inside of nuclear plants, and I've been in rainforests with people who live there, or scientists who study them. I've been with economists. I've been with political scientists. I've been with terrific cooks. You name it. It's just a wonderful, wonderful opportunity. Because when you're a journalist and you travel, it's not just the taxi cab drivers, the bartenders, and the waiters that you meet. You have entree to knock on any door and say, I'm here, I'm working on a story, and I don't mean to bother you, but I would really appreciate the opportunity to sit and talk with you. And and learn about this place where I'm in and learn about you and what you do.
Mm-hmm.
And that's basically how it happened.
Yeah. And do you find when you, so part of me, I'm just like so interested in this because weirdly during this, this pandemic, I've started this program that we're all on tonight, right? And in some ways it's an interesting, it's felt a little bit like I've been touching into journalism in the sense that of bringing folks like yourself into the space and being really just curious about how people live their lives and what they care about. So I'm curious for you, Alan, do you find that when you connect with folks as a journalist, like, do you find that they're mostly receptive or not? Or like, what is the dynamic when you are entering into a relationship when you're on a story?
Well, the reception is kind of a mix of things because there's all different kinds of people. And sometimes, I've interviewed a few heads of state. They are not necessarily the most relaxed, unguarded human beings on earth. Mm-hmm. Though I pretty much tend to avoid politicians because you always know already what they're going to say. Mm-hmm. When I want to interview someone, first of all, I never use that word. If I say interview, it puts people on their guard immediately. Like, I simply say, I'm working on something. I'd really like the opportunity just to talk with you or to have a conversation. Mm-hmm. And people are much more apt to enter into a conversation. The way that I get people to open up once they've agreed to speak to me is very simple. Mm-hmm. And it works all the time. And it's something that very few beginning journalists understand how to do. It took me a while to learn how to do it. It's basically this. The little game that I play sometimes when I teach a writing workshop, I ask everybody in the workshop, what's the most important thing in the world to you? Mm-hmm. The most important thing. Mm-hmm. And then, people raise their hands. I'll call on them and they say, world peace. And I'll say, you're a liar. Okay. My husband, you're a liar. My family, you're a liar. My children, you're a liar. Finally, there's always some smug person who's sort of slinking in his or her seat. And finally, is going, me, thank you, an honest human being. The fact is that we are all hardwired to be self-centered. We have to preserve ourselves. We are the center of our own universe. We're the most interesting topic in our life. How we interact with anything and everything, be it our beliefs or other people, has to do with how we feel about it. Mm. So when I go to see a scientist, or when I go to see a performer, shall we say, because my goal is to find out what the science is all about, or what, like you're asking me, what inspired you to become a singer or whatever it is. I don't start asking them about the science or about the music. Mm-hmm. I will say, thanks so much for letting me come and, take some of your precious time. Before we start talking, though, about, this molecule that you've discovered, how did you get interested in this? In fact, how did you become a physicist in the first place? Mm-hmm. And then I will be, regaled by a story that is sort of an origin story for that person. Mm-hmm. And it's always, I was a kid and someone gave me a microscope and I looked under it and I saw these little things and suddenly I realized, wow. So I read up about it and I found out, these are single cells, and they're made of this kind of material, and there's molecules, and one thing leads to another, and you get a story that takes you through your whole career. But as they're telling me, they're really warming up, because subconsciously they feel that I am interested in the same thing that interests them the most, themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And by the time we get to the point where we're in the present and now we're looking at this molecule that they've discovered, I've got them. We are meeting as human beings. The same thing in my writing. The World Without Us, which is a book in which I posited, what would happen if humans disappeared? How would the rest of nature perform without the pressures that we're just constantly heaping on it? It's kind of a red herring, because there are so many human beings in that book. I follow a whole lot of people into all these different places who either are experts, or they're natives, or they've got native understanding. And through their experience, the reader has someone to connect with, because the reader is also a human being. And it's really hard for the reader to connect with something, as tiny as a molecule, or as, vast as the universe. But if you can meet a person who I've unlocked through my encounter with them, their passion for what they do. Readers recognize passion, and they will follow passion anywhere. It doesn't matter what a person's passionate for. We're all fascinated by what turns other people on. And, I get to ignite passions in people by asking them for their stories, and then that leads me up into their work or to whatever they're experiencing now, and I get to pass that on to readers. This is a pretty good job.
It is a really good job. I think that both of us, being a theater maker, I think that both of us share this idea, this love of the gift of stories, the gift of people's passion and unlocking that. And I mean, reading A World Without Us, and I kind of feel like I was really struck. One of the first things that struck me about, even just in the first, 3 chapters or 4 chapters that I was reading, I was like, this guy, Alan Weisman, talks to a lot of people. He makes a lot of relationships. And I just sort of noticed, I was like, the intent, the clarity, and the intent of really making relationships. It's not just, it didn't feel like, let me get some information from you. It felt like you were actually cultivating a relationship with folks across the world.
Well, I think that is correct. Again, it's the pleasure to me of the way that I do my work. I've never been a daily news reporter. Those people have to go in there and they have to slam bang. They have to find out the facts. They have to talk to the witnesses. They have to talk to the victim. They have to talk to the perpetrator if they get a chance. And bam, they got to be back at their keyboards, because something has to go up in the next edition. And with today's 24/7 news cycle, the pressure on those people is enormous. Mm-hmm. I work at a slower pace. I've never worked for a newspaper other than to be a feature writer, which basically that's the stuff that's section B, and they're usually longer pieces, and the reader gets to spend more time, and I get to spend more time in the stories. I've written them for most of the major magazines in the United States and several in other countries. And The World Without Us is not my only book. I've written 5 other books, and those books all, give me the opportunity to really, really get deeply into a subject. And I will go to a country, and it's, and I will spend 3 weeks there minimum at a time, and take the time to get to know the people that I'm talking to, just the way I described before. It's some of those people become lifelong friends, which is a wonderful thing. some of the other journalists who I meet in those countries who help me find the people that I need to find or whose stories I have read before, they become colleagues lifelong. And we constantly are in touch. If ever we're going to be working in the other one's country, or we need a contact in a third country that we might know. I mean, you know, that's another way that these relationships uh, empower and really saturate what I write.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. And in our last conversation last week, you had described yourself, I wrote this down because I loved it, as a hard-bitten journalist and a hopeless romantic. And I was wondering if you could just speak to like hard-bitten and a hopeless romantic, like what, you know, what does that mean for you to be a hard-bitten journalist? I mean, I think I have an idea of what that means. And then like, how does that side of you connect with the hopeless romantic?
So I'll start with the romantic side. Two of the biggest influences on me in my life were the fact that I grew up next to a forest and a wetland, and nature was my playground. It was a magical place. It was, if anybody spends time in nature, you know that nature does to you exactly what you did to us at the beginning of this thing. It quiets you down. It quiets you down with its variety, its immensity, its aromas, its colors, and its sounds, and it's just sheer life. You know, you can stand under a tree that's not moving, and something in you will move. It just absolutely, you know, it embraces you in a mysterious way that I can't explain. I can only enjoy that mystery and try to join in on it. So, you know, just like so many of the romantic poets were nature freaks, you know, that was one of the great influences. The other one was my older sister, who loved literature and loved fiction. And I started, you know, we copied, you know, our older siblings. And when I was in third grade, I was reading Victor Hugo novels, and I just fell in love with stories, as you were saying. And to this day, I read more fiction than, even though I'm a nonfiction writer. I mean, fiction to me gives me, it's like taking my narrative vitamins. You know, fiction just absolutely fills me with wonder. And what you do too, theater. I mean, when something that transformative happens through the magic of art, be it literary art or be it musical art, and I guess music was also a big influence on me because I started studying it when I was about 5 years old. You know, that stuff is really transformative. And then, you know, zooming up to when I got started doing what I was doing, I hated law school. I was there for the wrong reasons. I was there because I was, even though I was a literature major in college, because, you know, I loved it so much. Just from looking at my professors, I knew I didn't want to be one. And we won't get into that. But I didn't have the guts to be a writer. So I went to law school, and like I say, I bombed out in 3 months, but the only thing I was good at was legal writing. And I decided, okay, if I'm good at writing, well, maybe I can become a journalist, and then maybe I'll work my way up to being a fiction writer. So what happened is, becoming a journalist, I fell in love with what journalism does. Journalism requires you to be an incredibly acute observer and an imaginative observer. You have to think about every angle of what you're writing about, but you also have to be grounded in facts. You've got to get the story right. You can't screw up. If you tell a great story, but you mess up one fact, some reader is going to be all over you the next day, and it's just terribly embarrassing. So gradually what happened to me is that I learned that even though you don't get to go off in the flights of fantasy the way novelists get to do, there's a lot of power to be speaking the truth. There's a lot of power to have gone out and researched something so well that you know you've got it right. You've talked to everybody involved. You've gotten a whole array of opinions. And it's not this cliche, well, let's hear what the Democrats say and let's hear what the Republicans say. You talk to enough people till you start to understand where the truth lies. It's oftentimes between those extremes, but it's not necessarily smack dab in the middle. And then, because I've been always writing feature-length stuff, or I've been writing magazine-length stuff, or finally book-length stuff, I get to use all of the arts of literature to express those truths I've found in the most readable possible way. As a journalist, we have a job of learning and exploring the truth and then communicating it to as wide an audience as possible. When I'm writing, like any other writer, part of this is my self-expression, even though I am anchored to facts. But I have to use all the tricks that novelists use. I have to develop real life human beings on the page as if they are characters in a novel. I have to find those little rich details about them that will enter a reader's imagination and stick there. I have to use dialogue because that's action. That's not just a talking head interview. I then get to do what we in literature call compression. You can say a few things that are not in real time like dialogue is. You can say a word. I mean, here is a word from that wonderful evocative novelist, A Canticle for Leibowitz. An entire paragraph. It goes like this: centuries passed, period. You can do that. You can compress centuries into a couple of words, and then in the next paragraph, pick up again. It's I get to use all this stuff, and it's just a joy. But the hard-bitten part about journalism is that part about the facts. Mm-hmm. I have to make sure if somebody is saying something to me that I'm not in my head because I agree with them, I believe, they're saying stuff that I feel is right. Mm-hmm. Boy, I better check those facts. I can't let my emotions override. Mm-hmm. I have to, and in journalism, it's not just one fact. You have to have at least two. You have to have two corroborating witnesses. This is just some shop talk, but for every magazine article, I submit, I will submit a document that's about 5 times long that is just all my sources. Mm-hmm. Names, telephone numbers, email addresses, sometimes transcripts of the dialogue, and I will submit a sheaf, or these days, a list of links to articles that corroborate what I am saying. So you really got to hold your own feet to the fire to get it right. But when you do, you've got a lot going for you, and you can make an argument about something that you strongly believe in much more powerfully. Not just going with emotion, but also going with the facts.
Great, thank you. I think it's really interesting, this notion of, having the passion, having the emotions, and then, finding a way to balance that, with these actual facts, like doing the research. And I've been thinking, so I want to take us into this moment for a second, but before I take us into this moment, I want to touch upon something you said earlier, which was this notion of like compressing time, right? And I'm very fascinated in how we use time. I think time is very political. I think that, um, there's so much about, ownership of time and so forth. But one of the things that struck me when I was reading your book was the way in which you take us to the present, and then you take us way out. You shoot us way in the future, tens of thousands, 100,000 years or something, right? And then you take us way back, right, with the like megafauna and all of that. And the kind of time scale that you are kind of looking at, I think what you called the panoramic view in our last conversation. I'm curious, I've read the article that you sent me recently. And then I also read this book, but I'm curious, is that true in all your writing? Do you feel like you are like doing this kind of playing this accordion with time, for lack of better?
You've used two musical terms to describe what I do. You just accused me of playing an accordion. and before you described the book as an aria. And in fact, that book is structured as a symphony. It starts out with a prelude. It has 4 long movements in it, and then it ends with a coda. And I purposely use those words because the structure of music always interests me. Music is based on rhythm. And even though writing is something that, is done silently, actually a reader is hearing those words on some level. And one of the tricks I always use when I am cleaning up I write draft after draft. The article that Amy was just referring to is a short essay I did for the Boston Globe magazine recently for Earth Day. I think that my website is splashed up there somewhere, and you can find it there. Sorry, I lost my train of thought of why I brought that up, but it's the sense that it's basically it's sound. For that article, I think I did about 12 drafts, but at a certain point, I read them out loud. And then I start to hear where the rhythm is wrong, too many short sentences in a row or too many long sentences. So I vary the rhythm that way. But I can also vary the rhythm with time. I can use real time, like I can have dialogue, and then I can compress time, and I can use basically a summary and then move us into the next thing. In The World Without Us, which is basically, for those of you who haven't read it, it's a book that I wrote because I want a world with us. I was just very disturbed at what my species was doing to this planet. I've been traveling all over the earth covering environmental disasters from pole to pole, from the ozone hole to the melting Arctic to the Chernobyl disaster to rainforests that were burning down. And I began to realize that there was a connection, and that's the theme of our talk tonight, among all these things. So I wanted to write about a global, the global environmental crisis that I realized that we had. It took me a while to figure out how to do that, because just the idea of reading a book about a global environmental crisis, particularly one that, readers think, oh my God, is this going to be another one of those books that's going to make me feel guilty about what I do? And at the end, I find out unless we change, we're all going to die. People don't want to read those things. Only other environmentalists who already know that, as a journalist, again, that wide audience. So I was looking for a way to bring in a much wider audience. And then finally I figured out, well, if the bottom line is people are worried that we're all going to die, maybe if I killed everybody off right in the beginning, they wouldn't have to worry about that anymore. But then they got to hang around to see what would happen after us. What's the future going to be like? I mean, none of us has crystal balls, but I could go to a lot of experts or people who just live in a place and say, what would happen if you weren't here? Or what would happen if no one was here? And then, we get to see the planet that what we'd leave behind would be the sum total of our environmental impact, but I wouldn't have to use that awful phrase that turns people off. And then we'd see the world gradually become more natural as nature started rushing in where we suddenly weren't anymore. But one of the things that I realized I needed to do while I was researching the book, I hadn't planned this, was like, well, what was the Earth like before we were here? And so when I went into that, when I started talking to scientists, paleontologists, learning about the evolution of the human species, then suddenly the panorama leapt out at me. If I can describe what the world was like before us, how we got to be, then how we got to be what we call civilized, and how we then got to be technological, and how we got into the mess that we're in right now, then people would start to think, wow, this is really amazing, and we might be putting ourselves into a situation where we might be extinguishing ourselves, our own species, prematurely, unless we don't watch out, which was the conclusion that I wanted people to come to. And then to start thinking about, wow, well, this world without us, because the world does get restored in my book. My book is totally not dystopian. The world is just gorgeous. But I wanted people to think, well, is there a way that we can add ourselves back into this picture? Only instead of in mortal combat with nature and just in harmony with it. And then that opened up the way that I ended the book, which maybe you want to talk about. And that also was the springboard for the book that followed that, which is called Countdown. So, that was a long answer to your question about time.
Yeah.
All of that about time and rhythm, is both a way of keeping the reader engrossed, keeping the writer interested, and also just making sure the reader never gets bored. I mean, there are certain ways you learn to time the end of a movement in a book. So the reader says, oh, this is a good time. I can set this down and I can come back to it later. And, it's something that it takes a long time to learn how to do that. Fortunately, we get a good chunk of time to live our lives. And I hope that the current generation of young people coming up have as long as I've been privileged to have, because of course, one of the reasons we're meeting tonight is that we're at a very critical moment in history.
Yeah, and I'm seeing some folks are wanting to ask some questions, but I want to hold off just for a moment, if people don't mind, and just kind of, I do want to talk about the end of your book, but before we do that, Alan, I'd really like to just kind of tap into this moment right now, since we are talking about time, and in your view, what's your perspective right now? I mean, we've been talking about crashing the system, right? That we're crashing the system that allowed us to evolve. I think that literally, that's a sentence that I lifted from something you wrote. And then also this notion of 400 years of racial trauma is erupting in our culture right now. And that's also a system. Anyway, just wanted to throw that out, if you could touch upon that before we open up for questions.
Well, sure. All these things are connected. When I talked about that forest and wetland, that was so much part of my personal formation, and which led me into writing about science and ecology as much as possible. And by the way, ecology, I just being able to go into the field with ecologists, which I was fortunate enough to do early in my career, taught me more about writing than any writing teacher ever taught me.
Mm-hmm.
Because ecology is literally the science of how things are connected. And I've learned that it's so fascinating to learn why is that hole in that tree, and why are all those insects rushing towards it. And you know, everything turns out to be connected to everything else in an ecosystem, and everything turns to be connected in, you know, in our own lives. Readers love learning how things got to be the way they are and what's connected to what. So that forest and that wetland happened to be on the outskirts of Minneapolis. I grew up, fortunately for me, in one of the most beautiful cities in the United States, a city that's covered with lakes, where I learned how to swim, where I learned how to fish. I lifeguarded those lakes when I was in college. Um, there was one of the main beaches of those lakes was a tacitly segregated beach. And one half of it was black, one half of it was working class white. I worked a lot of other beaches too that had different demographics. Um, I saw, and this was way back when a racist named George Wallace was running for president of the United States. I saw that beach erupt in a riot one night. One of my colleagues was Minneapolis's first black lifeguard. He helped to calm things down, but it got to be, you know, really, really difficult. I grew up on the north side of Minneapolis, which was the Jewish part of town. When I grew up, Minneapolis also had at one time been called the most anti-Semitic city in the United States. I wrote about this in one of my books. And when a journalist revealed how severe that was, Jews could go to medical school, but they weren't allowed to even do internships in Minneapolis hospitals. There were no Jewish teachers in the city, and I could go on and on about this. But the then mayor of Minneapolis, when that article came out, is a guy named Hubert Humphrey, appointed a Blue Ribbon Commission to see if it was all that bad. And the Blue Ribbon Commission reported back to him after a few months that it was actually worse, that there were huge parts of the city that were redlined, where as it said that Jews, Negroes, and red people could not live. Eventually, one suburb dropped the red line, and Jews started moving out of the inner city. And so I grew up in the one suburb where there could be Jews, and it was only about 20 to 30% of us. But among us, among my class, people who attended my high school were the great classical guitarist Sharon Isbin, the Coen brothers, the filmmakers, Tom Frieden from the New York Times, Al Franken for a while. We were all these Jewish kids in this suburb. When the Jews rushed out, the blacks moved in. And this is a pattern that's seen in a lot of cities. And then finally, those riots that I saw at that lake exploded in the late 1960s on the north side of Minneapolis. They quieted down. Minneapolis became this placid and beautiful and prosperous city again, only there was a forgotten class. They were in inner city schools, and then on top of them came refugees from Somalia, Hmong refugees from the Far East. My niece is one of them. My nephew's married to a Hmong woman. These populations of poor immigrants, well, my own family, we were poor immigrants. My father's father was assassinated in a pogrom for being Jewish back in Russia. But we had the fortune of having white skin. And what is going on today with the immigrant population in my city, and the Black population, which some of whom were immigrants and some of whom were part of the northern exodus of Black people from the South. These are really, really, really hard issues that we have to grapple with right now. It's amazing to me that an incident in my city, Minneapolis, detonated a national movement and detonated now a world movement. There are huge crowds marching in cities in Paris, in Taiwan, you know, against racial inequality. I think one of the reasons, I mean, the obvious reason is that these people have been pent up for so long and it was just one killing too many, though every killing is a killing too many, I guess. But the other thing is that we have all been dealing with pent up emotions, locked into our sequestered spaces during a quarantine. And finally, there was a moral issue that allowed a lot of people to explode in the street and throw caution to the winds of rage. And we are in the midst of a social uprising, a major pandemic like the world has not seen for 100 years and has never seen one like this because of the number of people on this planet and the ease at which contagions can pass from one to another through the way we trade and the ways that we travel. And then behind all of that, there is an existential crisis having to do with the climate change and extinction that is making the pandemic, and basically even in all of these social interactions that are so volatile and so important to all of us because we're human beings, to nature, not very important at all. We're just one other species. Nature's got a million of them out there. It's got tens of millions out there. And in the history of this planet, most of those species have gone extinct. And all the ones that are living right now will go extinct again, just like everybody dies. But none of us want to go extinct right now. None of us want this beautiful planet to go. And all of us are feeling that it is time to somehow leap beyond this very, very difficult barrier of color.
Thanks, Alan.
Did that tie it all up?
Yeah, you really did. You really dug in there. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I want to give I want to give some space for some comments and some questions right now, and then at the end, I really do want to touch upon these ending thoughts in your book. Let's open up to comments and questions. Yeah.
Hey, can you all hear me okay?
Yes. Hi, Clint.
Okay, hey. Yeah, so thank you, Alan, so much for being on here. I feel like a giddy little kid by some twist of fate. I get to talk to Alan Weisman. This is like really cool. I want to kind of play off of a lot of the different things you said as far as interconnectedness and time and the different factors going into everything now. And I'll use a little less sexy of a metaphor than like music or accordions or arias. I'll use the metaphor of like a computer simulation. We have all these variables right now on the planet, and all these have been plugged in and they're all running at once. And there's all these different variables interacting. You could almost run it just like a mathematical simulation in theory, although it'd be infinite variables. But my concern is the timeliness of tunnel vision of the media and the main conversation going on. And I've noticed this more and more in the past, since Trump was in office, for example, where there is a topical timeliness to the issue we're supposed to be talking about. at this time at the exclusion of all the other variables. So when the Floyd killing happened, the riots happened, the protests happened, obviously, you know, in addition to being concerned about racial injustice, I started looking at these protests and thinking massive people in massive cities, they're spreading the coronavirus. This is too high risk. How come this went out the window? But it's so kind of unsexy to say that in the midst of that, because it seems like to some you may be undermining racial injustice. And, you know, I've thought as you did that a lot of these people are cooped up. And I've even wondered, how sincere is this outpouring of support for Black Lives Matter? And how much is it just people wanting something to do because they've been cooped up? And of course, it could go the other way too. When there was hysteria about the coronavirus and everybody's wanting everybody to take it seriously, and you start getting concerned about corruption at the top or corrupt power, that's off the narrative of the moment. So it's like zooming into one variable at the exclusion of others, and it's being paced, I don't know, by the media or just by a sense of groupthink coming together, where there's something we're supposed to be focusing on and everything else is off topic. And the last thing I want to throw in there too with that is another thing that might seem counter narrative to some progressive activists, which would be Yeats' poem, The Second Coming, where he's talking about, you know, deeper and deeper into the widening gyre the sinner cannot hold. And then at the end of that, it's the best lack all conviction while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And I see that going on now, but it's like to say the best lack all conviction and have a sense of detachment, you know, almost seems like you don't care. And yet the wisdom of Yeats is, I'm kind of down with that. So I know I said a lot there, and thanks for indulging my question.
Well, you did, except I think that I think that 2 weeks ago, I would have agreed with that dour conclusion of Yeats's, you know, which he wrote at a very low point, and that's, it's an amazing poem, and you know, he pointed out that things do fall apart. But what we're seeing right now, I think, is a level of conviction that I find, you know, I find myself feeling hope for the first time in quite a while.
Mm-hmm.
And that's huge, because we have been up against so much, you know, so much horror, you know, for the past few years. We have seen democracy after democracy after democracy on this planet slide into demagoguery, including this country. You know, this is the country that Sinclair Lewis was warning us about when he wrote It Can't Happen Here. And it's been happening here. And as someone who writes about the ecosystem and what is going on in the world, I understand how this works. People are scared. People are scared on this planet because they're scared of losing what they have. They're scared that the future looks worse than the past for the first time in human history. And whether they're a climate denier or not, they all know what's going on. And that scares the hell out of them. When people are frightened, it's a perfect time. Machiavelli wrote about this. I mean, it's a simple time for a strong leader to come in, promise them that they're going to take them back to some glorious past that never really existed in the first place, give them back everything that was theirs, and make sure that some other isn't going to come and steal it from them, which of course, you know, just whips up all the energy of racism to a froth. So this is what we've been experiencing here in the United States. They've been experiencing it in many other countries, from Hungary to India. And on top of it, we have this pandemic that's been frightening us even more. Well, the pandemic has gone on for quite a while. I understand why this pandemic is not going to go away anytime soon, because in human history, there have been a lot of pandemics. The one in 1918, the Spanish flu, lasted 2.5 years. Back then, there was a quarter of the number of people on this planet than there are today. And at the end of the world without us, I wanted people to think about, how we can become harmonious with nature. But in the end of my research of that book, I smashed into a really difficult fact. And that is that every 4 days, we add about 1 million more people to the planet. And that's clearly not a sustainable number. There's no way that we can be sustainable if that is happening. So I left hanging in the air at the end of that book if we should try to do something, even something as hated as what the Chinese tried, just limiting everybody to one child. If nobody liked that policy, well, do we have to do something? And that became such an important talking point about the book. And I talked about that book all over the world because it's now out in almost 36 languages, that my next book, Countdown, was about that question. How many people can fit on this planet comfortably without capsizing it? Well, it happens that right now, this enormous number, we quadrupled in a single century. That's unprecedented in the history of biology for a large animal. And that has created incredible tension, incredible opportunity for disease to pass through. So now we find ourselves with this disease, and then suddenly with all the pent-up anxiety and tension, and that includes for the police themselves. Just imagine what it's like to be a policeman right now, every day going out and facing the public, risking your life because you're facing so many people who are carrying potentially a lethal virus. These guys are not exactly walking onto their shift relaxed already. Anyhow, this incident happened in Minneapolis. It was brutal. It was hideous. And suddenly, like I said before, the world just threw caution to the winds and they took to the streets. And to me, the fact that they took to the streets and joined Black people to say, this is crazy, we can't have this happening anymore, knowing that they were exposing themselves, I think that's magnificent. And I don't think that the media has compartmentalized. Sometimes when you're writing just a story for a newspaper or for a website, you have to stick to the subject. You don't have lots of words or lots of space. But I would like to point out that in this reaction, the media have been out there. I am very proud of other journalists, particularly in my country, but all over the world, because they have exposed themselves to the coronavirus and they have been the targets of police brutality. 4 journalists were shot, including 2 whole camera crews, were shot in Minneapolis alone. And many of you saw the CNN reporter, arrested on live television. And then his crew was shot up with rubber bullets. A photographer lost her eye to a rubber bullet. There have been 400 police shootings of journalists or police acts of brutality against journalists since all of this began. Journalists are taking enormous risk and they are targets. You've probably seen the viral video now of the police and Minnesota State Police going and slashing the tires of journalists. Give the media a break here. They are doing their best and they are doing it to inform all of us.
Thanks, Alan.
Sure.
Do we have some other questions right now? Nancy, I see you have a question. Oh, I think Nancy needs to be unmuted.
I can unmute for you, Nancy. You can also unmute yourself. I have unmuted you. Oh, we might be unmuting at the same time, so why don't you unmute
All right,
yourself?
can you hear me?
Yeah, hi, Nancy.
Hi. Alan, I want to thank you. Thank you. Thank you for this beautiful quote. You can stand under a tree that's not moving, and something in you will move. Yes, yes, yes. So thank you for that. Is that your original?
It just popped out of my mouth. I mean, I'm sorry, I was not taking notes on myself.
I did.
I'm glad you guys are recording because sometimes
We are
that can
recording.
happen. Oh man, I don't have anything to write down. And but I will give a quick plug for fiction. Richard Powers' book, The Understory, may be one of the most magnificent novels I've ever read in my life. The Pulitzers got it right, and they awarded him their prize. And if you love trees, he makes trees into characters in that book.
Yes.
It's just.
What's the title?
It's called The Overstory. I'm sorry, did I misspeak? The Overstory.
The overstory.
By
Yeah.
Richard Powers. And it's overstory in both senses of the word. It's that wonderful canopy when you are standing under a tree, and it is the story that looms over all of us.
Thank you so much. I have a vocal album called Like a Tree. I mean, it's the center of my heart. So, but that quote, thank you.
You're welcome. Wow.
Yeah. Other thoughts?
Hi, Alan. It's nice to meet you. I actually wanted to just ask in terms of connectivity as well and interconnectivity and how that expands to even humanity, right? Because I mean, I've been doing this show actually ever since Amy started it, Amy, Josh, and Sango. And for me, like, yeah, I very much feel a humanitarianism in terms of just the interconnectivity between human beings. You're not, just Asian, Black, white, and just, all these separate categories. We're all human, we're all connected, and yet all our stories happen to bond and, intersect with each other, and they all happen to link up. So I very much feel that, and just wanted to know your thoughts about it.
Well, one of the things that I learned when I was doing The World Without Us is that we are all Africans. That's where our species evolved. And then because we were all hunter-gatherers, we kept moving, looking for food. And eventually we got all the way as far as, across the Bering Straits and down the Tierra del Fuego and across the water to Australia. And yet we all come from a common source. And we have an enormous amount in common. I've worked in about 60 countries. And, some of those countries, don't look anything like the United States. For my last book, for Countdown, I went to Iran for 2 weeks. And yet, Iranians and I and my wife who accompanied me, we're just people when it comes down to it. And we found out, this is going to sound like a cliche, but cliches oftentimes get repeated and become cliches because they are true. People are, we have more in common than we have separating us. And the opportunity to get to know each other is, the differences melt away. People are meeting each other on the barricades and in the streets and in the protests right now. People are going to be a lot more gentle with each other, I hope, for quite a while. Yes, I know that there's this, this counter demonstration out there. That base out there is shrinking. The hope that I'm feeling right now is that I kind of think our country has bottomed out. I think that happened in Lafayette Park when Trump went for his photo op and he just read the moment wrong. And that has backfired, and now things are backfiring left and right. The generals are deserting him. Some of senators in his own party are deserting him. I guess I'm betraying my own biases here, but you know, as a journalist, this is not a bias. This is not left or this is not right. I've always been a registered independent, and I have voted for Republicans who I thought were better candidates than the Democrat running against them. And by the way, a two-party system isn't really much of a democracy. It doesn't give us many choices, but it's the one that we have right now. And I hope come November that the pressure that is now turning against this president and his party are going to make it really hard for them to fix the elections, to mess around with voter suppression, though, and I'm happy to say this out loud, Trump's whole neglect of the body politic during this coronavirus, his whole insistence that, hey, this is no problem. We can, you know, we can all go back to work with, you know, this is going to be over by Easter. This is going to be over by Memorial Day, you know, all those things. It's kind of a win-win situation for him, because if it turns out that it doesn't, and a lot more people get infected, just by the way, you know, people group together in cities, more poor people are going to suffer from this. And that's a very effective form of voter suppression, when you are killing off the voters who are against you. There are going to be a lot of sacrifices made. A lot of people are getting sick who are braving the virus to go out on the streets. George Floyd made an ultimate sacrifice. He didn't intend to, but his family is sacrificing their grief to speak out right now. This is a momentous moment that connects us all.
We
Go ahead, Josh.
do have a question. Yeah, we have a question from Lori. Lori, I've unmuted you if you wanted to put that into the conversation. Lori, are you there? You're unmuted.
Where's Lori?
Lori's here. Oh yeah, Lori, you
You should be able to speak, Lori.
Yeah.
Just speak?
Yeah.
Oh, this is easier.
Yeah.
I was just wondering how important it is that our stories and music will carry on to generations, even in this horrible time where there's a possibility of us going extinct. That I think that our stories need to be told, and that's, you know, one of the important things that I'm learning, because there are so many of them and people are not telling them.
Yeah, I have a response to that, and Amy, I'd like to hear your response too. You know, they used to call prostitution the old profession, but that was not the oldest profession. I mean, hunting and gathering are the oldest professions, but then at night when people would get together, our ancestors, and they would sort of, you know, like grunt around the fire and point to things, and somebody grunted a little more eloquently than anybody else, and attention got riveted to that person, and eventually the storyteller emerged, and that storyteller has been with us forever. And I think that, you know, it's become part of our genetic inheritance that we tell stories. It's just a magnificent way of bridging time and bridging the difference among us. We tell stories in a number of ways. I tell them with words. People tell them with music. Artists like my wife tell them with sculpture. One of the most wonderful parts about writing The World Without Us was writing the part about, what that humans have created will last the longest. And it turns out that it's our art. Bronze is, because it's very close to elemental copper, is going to be around for an awful long time. Thousands, maybe even millions of years. And to think that long after we're gone, that Rodin's sculptures are still going to be there. Something about that, it feels very fitting to me. Ceramic is basically, it's a rock, and as long as nothing smashes it, ceramic will last, until some new geologic event, subsumes it down with the rest of the bedrock and creates a new continent. And then I had the great fortune to interview the artist who Carl Sagan hired to put together the 2 golden records that went on the 2 Voyager spacecrafts in the late 70s, and went off into outer space, bearing on them recordings of sounds and images of every culture on Earth, from African chants to Louis Armstrong. There's a soprano, is it Dawn Upshaw? I can't remember who I believe so, who sings the Queen of the Night's aria from Mozart's The Magic Flute, in which the highest note in the human register is reached, which is kind of, this is really us reaching. And those spacecraft are now beyond the solar system long after our sun has expanded into a red dwarf and the Earth is just a cinder and all traces of us are gone. That stuff's going to still be out there. And it goes with a little diagram that any culture that might find it in some other galaxy or some other star, they might just figure out how to play those records. There's actually a stylus and hear those sounds and see those pictures and know that we were there. And that's one of the things that gives me a great deal of peace, knowing that.
Thank you. It gives me a great deal of peace.
Thanks, Lori. Yeah, I mean, I think that this notion of, I love this notion of the music, the sounds floating out beyond our solar system. And this idea also that comes up at the end of your book around the radio waves and all the recorded music. And even I think you mentioned something about the energy coming from our minds.
Well, our minds are radio transmitters, and radio waves, just keep going. Once they're broadcast, they go out there at the speed of light and they become more and more and more and more attenuated. But some incredibly sensitive machine out there, or some incredibly sensitive deity out there, might be able to tune in and hear us. I used in the book, the example of the I Love Lucy show, and I showed, as the show progressed, that from the very first episode of Lucy and Desi, which is now passing Arcturus and going on, towards, the next galaxy over from the Milky Way, we may be long gone, but some incredibly sensitive entity out there might be able to actually tune into that. And they won't know what we're like, maybe, but they will get to hear us laugh.
Yeah. Yeah. And thus we have the romantic.
Shucks, ma'am, what can I say?
I think the thing that strikes me about stories, since we're on the sound of, one of the things that I've been discovering, in running moment to moment and the sort of doing these sessions, I sort of realized that need oral storytelling. And that, you know, we've been thinking about how do we survive? How have we survived all these, like all this time, you know? And to me, stories are a way that we learn, a way that we connect, a way that we try to understand ourselves and our relationship to the planet that we're on, and try to understand the things that happen. And I think that the sort of, I mean, it just takes, I used to teach at a preschool years ago. So for me, and I had younger brothers and sisters, I was the oldest, and I was oldest of all the cousins as well. So I spent a lot of time sitting with children, reading stories. And that feels like it's just so important. It's like, it feels like a story is not, it enters in. And so the soul maybe is constructed of stories. Maybe that's a theory I have. I don't know.
You know, I don't know. It's one of those things, you know, to me, what makes artwork, what makes storytelling magical, what makes music incredible, to me, those are mysteries that we are not supposed to solve. It's like, you know, like dissecting a songbird to figure out why it sings. It's not going to work. You know, I think, you know, rather than trying to solve those mysteries, our role is just to deepen them and to embrace them and to be part of them. But I agree with you that, you know, there's something so fundamental. I once was doing a story for the Los Angeles Times Magazine in Mexico, in the Barranca del Cobre, Copper Canyon, which is inhabited by the Tarahumara Indians, who anthropologists believe, and they believe, you know, it may have been there for about 10,000 years. And I was in these very, very remote villages where, unfortunately, because this is in Chihuahua, which is a state that borders the United States, and yet it's this very remote region. This is a canyon that is bigger and deeper than the Grand Canyon where they are. And, but because it's remote and because it is conveniently close to the United States, makes it a wonderful place to grow drugs and to ship them into the United States. And the story that I was doing was on heroin poppy cultivation, where drug lords were forcing the Tarahumaras, who are, you know, they're some of the people who gave us corn, to convert their milpas into poppy fields. And the ones who objected were just getting blown away. And Tarahumara Indians were getting killed off at about a rate of 3 a week when I went down there. So it was a very harrowing story to do. There were, I won't go into all the risks that we took, my photographer and I, to do this story. But at one point, we're in this incredibly remote village where these people have been living for around 10,000 years. And finally, they've decided that they have to leave. They have to move to Chihuahua City because it's no longer safe. Mm-hmm. And I said to the oldest man in the village, the elder, I said, how can you leave a place where your people have lived for 10,000 years? And he thought about the question and he said, we will just have to find new stories to tell our young people. There it is, you know. We are now in an age where everything is up for grabs. There are more refugees on this planet than any time in human history, about 75 million, according to the best sources on this, and expected to double within the next 5 years. I mean, this is what we're up against now on this planet. People are being forced off their homelands due to conflict, but that conflict is always about resources, and the resources are becoming scarcer due to climate change and due to overexploitation. people are going to be pushing against the borders of this country. People are going to be pushing their way across the Mediterranean into Europe. There are going to be many, many displaced people on this planet. Just as there are many displaced people living in Minneapolis, just as my father was a displaced person who landed in Minneapolis. And they're all going to have to find new stories in order to make their way in a strange land. And we're closely connected to all of them. Those stories are all going to encompass us. I hope that we can be on the receiving end of their stories. And I hope that then we will know how to tell them our stories in turn. So then we will come up with a story that we can all be telling as we face a very, very uncertain future, but one that we have a lot going for us. We have, all the information in the world, every library in the world is here in the palm of my hands. It's a question of, will we take that information and use it wisely?
Thank you, Alan. Thank you. It's a great note to end on.
Pleasure.
We're going to wrap up. We're going to wrap up. And I just want to, I want to thank you, Alan, for all you've shared. We're going to, we do have just a few things I do before we completely close. The first is just a question to take with you. I've got 2 questions, which is, what connections are emerging for you during this time? And what ways are you personally connected to the issues facing our species at this moment? So those are my 2 questions for us to continue on beyond this, this room that we're in right now. Also, we have a link that you can follow to connect with Alan, his books, his articles. I don't know, maybe you can have some more conversations.
Yeah, my email address is on there. And if you've got a question, I try to answer every email I get. So. And
then also I want to say that we are not doing Ragged Wing donations tonight, but instead we are doing Joshua's birthday cause. So Joshua just had a birthday, by the way. And yes, what does that say? What's that? Happy birthday, Joshua.
Thank you. That's very sweet. Yeah, I mean, this is the least that I can do, but I would love for you to donate directly to the bailproject.org. It's a national revolving bail fund, and it is a tool that prevents incarceration and combats racial and economic disparities in the bail system. So you can read more in our chat. You can go to thebailproject.org and donate. Thank you.
Yeah. So that's where we're driving donations tonight. We would love it if you would participate in any way, if you are able. I also want to plug Theater Bay Area's website, where you will find information about free webinars called The Changing Face of Theater, Creating During COVID. And there is also the Performing Artist Worker Relief Fund, which you can either contribute to or access for yourself. Next Thursday, normally I announce what's happening next Thursday. Well, guess what? We just actually don't know yet. It's a mystery Thursday. And we will know really soon. Hopefully by the end of tomorrow, we'll be able to announce it. But I've got like a couple people I'm talking to, and hopefully one of them is able to do next Thursday. So Mystery Thursday, stay tuned. We will be back at 5 o'clock. I want to thank Joshua and Sango, who's helping us out tonight. And thank you again to Alan.
Well, Amy, I want to thank you. And I did want to, and I want to thank you for directing a theater. I mean, we need the arts so much. To me, it's one of the things that justifies the continued existence of our species on this planet, the beauty that we add to it. And as I've often told my artist wife, Becky Kravitz, that you know, I would no sooner live on a planet without art and poetry and music and theater than I would live on a planet without trees. Thank you. The arts are more vitally important now than ever before.
Thanks for saying that. I know the artists on this call are all saying, somebody's saying that, hooray! So I really appreciate that, Alan. And yeah, and thanks to all who are attending tonight. I know that, you know, it's great to see all of you here. I'm kind of flipping through our guest gallery that I'm seeing right here. It's good to see all your faces. It's good to be in conversation with each of you. I encourage everyone to take care and to continue the dialogue and the sharing of stories as you move forward into the rest of your weekend. So may each of you be well and healthy, and I hope to see you next week on Moment to Moment. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alan.
Thank you.
Bye.